Everyone tells you to listen to your elders. But what if I told you? That's how most people stay trapped. We were raised to believe age equals wisdom, that gray hair means truth, that wrinkles mean depth. But look around. How many elders do you know who are still bitter, still afraid, still blaming the world? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Even fools grow older. Pause. Let it sink in. And yet, we let them shape our decisions, our careers, our marriages, our dreams, because society told us it's disrespectful to question them. But what if the people teaching you how life works never really figured it out themselves? What if you've been following advice that was never meant for your time, your path, your mind? This isn't about rebellion. It's about awakening, because the most dangerous prisons are built out of good intentions. And until you learn how to separate wisdom from noise, you'll live your life by someone else's fears. So stay with me till the end. I promise by the time this video ends, you'll never hear the words "listen to your elders" the same way again. There's a voice that follows us from childhood. You know the one. Listen to your elders. They've seen more life than you. They know better. At first, it sounds harmless, even loving, but slowly, it becomes law. From the dinner table to the classroom, we were told that experience automatically equals wisdom. That gray hair was proof of enlightenment. That wrinkles were the receipt for understanding life. And so we obeyed, because obedience was framed as respect, and questioning was painted as arrogance. Think about it when you were a child. Did you ever try to speak your mind in front of an elder, only to be shut down with, "You'll understand when you're older"? That phrase is the foundation of our conditioning. It trains you to believe that your current thoughts are invalid simply because of your age. It builds a hierarchy where time lived matters more than truth discovered. But here's the thing. Time doesn't automatically teach you anything. If it did, every old person would be wise, and every young person would be foolish. And we both know that's not true. I've met 15-year-olds with more emotional intelligence than their 40-year-old parents. I've met old men who've repeated the same mistakes for decades and still give advice about how the world works. Growing older just means you didn't die. It doesn't mean you evolved. Yet, our society clings to this myth because it's comfortable. It's easier to submit to hierarchy than to face uncertainty. Easier to borrow someone else's confidence than to build your own. When you grow up constantly told that elders know best, you internalize two dangerous beliefs: that your judgment can't be trusted, that authority is the same as truth. And that's where the damage begins. Because the moment you start doubting your own perception, you lose the ability to think freely. You stop observing life directly. You start living through other people's filters, their fears, their failures, their beliefs. And elders, even with the best intentions, often project those filters onto you. They're not always trying to mislead you, they're just speaking from their wounds. A father who failed in business will warn his son to play it safe. A mother betrayed in love will tell her daughter not to trust easily. A grandfather who grew up poor will say security first, even if it kills your ambition. These are emotional reflexes, not wisdom. But when you're young, you can't tell the difference. You believe them because you love them. And love blurs logic. You assume their pain is proof of insight. You assume that surviving equals understanding. But there's a difference between experience and reflection. Experience is what happens to you. Reflection is what you learn from it. Most people never make that leap. They age physically, but stay stuck mentally. They repeat patterns, defend them fiercely, and call it wisdom. That's why we all know someone older who still gossips, still blames others, still avoids accountability, yet loves giving advice. And if we're honest, we've listened. We've followed guidance that didn't feel right because they're older, they must know. Then years later, we realize that advice was built on fear, not truth. But by then, it's too late. You've already built a career you don't love, or stayed in a relationship you should have left, or suppressed your instincts because someone else convinced you they were wrong. And the tragedy is, they weren't malicious. They were just unaware. They mistook their survival mechanisms for universal rules. This is how generations unknowingly pass down dysfunction disguised as wisdom. We inherit fear as caution. We inherit control as discipline. We inherit conformity as tradition. And it all hides under the word respect. Let's be clear, respect doesn't mean obedience. Respect means acknowledgement. It means recognizing someone's experience, not surrendering your judgment to it. But no one taught us that nuance. So we learned to stay quiet. We learned to say yes when our gut screamed no. We learned to value approval more than authenticity. And the older we get, the more this inherited programming drowns out our own. That's why so many adults wake up one day and feel lost. They've been following a map drawn by someone else. A map that made sense decades ago in a different world, under different rules. But times change. Realities shift. What was once wise might now be outdated or even harmful. Still, the guilt remains. Because if you challenge an elder's advice, you're seen as arrogant. And no one wants to be called arrogant, especially when you have been raised to equate silence with virtue. So we stay quiet. We play small. We avoid conflict. But deep down, a quiet question starts forming. What if they're wrong? What if their version of truth doesn't fit my life? What if listening to them is what's keeping me stuck? That question is the beginning of wisdom. Because wisdom starts not with knowing, but with doubt. Doubt isn't disrespect. It's discernment. When you start questioning advice, even from those you love, you're not betraying them. You're finally taking responsibility for your own mind. And that's where this story begins. Because the world doesn't need more obedient sons or daughters who follow outdated scripts. It needs individuals who can listen deeply and still decide for themselves. Age deserves respect, but truth deserves loyalty. And between the two, truth must win. The first time I truly questioned an elder's advice, I remember feeling almost guilty. It was a simple moment barely worth remembering, but it cracked something open. A family friend, gray hair, heavy voice, liked to hold court at every gathering. He'd lean back in his chair, glass of sweet tea in hand, and declare how the world worked. Everyone nodded. Everyone agreed. He spoke with such certainty that disagreement felt like sin. One evening, he told me, play it safe. Don't take big risks. The world doesn't reward dreamers. At that time, I was deciding whether to quit a comfortable job and start something of my own. His words hit like cold water. He sounded so sure. But then I looked at his life. Same neighborhood for 40 years. Same complaints about the government, the economy, the neighbors, the youth. He'd done everything right, stayed safe, stayed stable, and yet he was miserable. That's when it clicked. People don't give advice from wisdom. They give advice from memory. From their story, not yours. And most stories are edited by fear. If you watch closely, you'll notice this everywhere. A man who failed in business will warn you that the market is rigged. A woman who married young and regrets it will tell you never to trust love. A parent who never chased a dream will insist that dreams are for the privileged. They call it being realistic. But what they really mean is, please don't remind me of what I never became. When someone older gives advice, they often protecting their own version of reality, because if your path succeeds while defying their rules, it threatens their sense of identity. That's why they need you to follow the same script. If you fail, they were right. If you succeed, their worldview cracks. This isn't cruelty, it's insecurity disguised as mentorship. I once met an old mechanic named Ravi who ran a dusty garage off a rural highway. He had rough hands, oil under his nails, and a calm face that looked carved from experience. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. One afternoon, a young boy from the village came by, curious, asking if he should leave school to help his father's shop. Everyone around laughed. What's the point of studying? Look at Ravi, he didn't need school. But Ravi shook his head. He said quietly, Don't do what I did. I stayed here because I was scared, not because I was wise. The crowd went silent. It was a rare kind of honesty, the kind that comes from real reflection, not age alone. That's the difference. Age adds years. Reflection adds depth. And very few people bother to reflect. We live in a society that confuses longevity with learning. But wisdom doesn't grow automatically, like hair or nails. It has to be cultivated through humility, curiosity, and pain consciously examined. Most elders never examine their pain. They just carry it forward, disguised as tradition or morality. They build walls out of old lessons and call it boundaries. They mistake the comfort of routine for the security of truth. And we, the younger ones, inherit those walls without even noticing. You can see this in families where a child wants to choose a different path: artist instead of engineer, traveler instead of banker, or even just single instead of married. The older generation's discomfort isn't about your happiness. It's about their control slipping. They believe deviation equals danger, because in their era, it often did. But every generation faces a new battlefield. What kept them safe might be what cages you. Here's what this really means. Age gives perspective, not prophecy. Experience gives stories, not scripture. And stories are useful only when you understand their context. When your grandmother warns you not to trust strangers, remember she lived in a time without seatbelts, smartphones, or 911. Her caution came from survival, not cynicism. When your uncle says, "Don't waste time chasing dreams," ask what dream he buried to become so certain. When a senior at work tells you don't make waves, look at what playing safe did for him. Context changes everything. Without it, advice becomes noise loud, confident noise that sounds like truth but carries the weight of old fears. Sometimes it takes failure to reveal this. You follow someone's advice, a parent, mentor, elder, because you trust them. You ignore your gut, compromise, play it safe. And when it doesn't work out, you look for someone to blame, but there's no villain, just borrowed wisdom that didn't fit. And that's when a strange shift happens. You start hearing advice differently. You stop being hypnotized by confidence. You start listening for subtext. You notice what's missing: the vulnerability, the uncertainty, the self-awareness. True wisdom carries humility. False wisdom hides behind authority. Once you see that difference, you can't unsee it. This revelation isn't about disrespect. It's about awakening. For the first time, you realize that the adults who shaped you are just older versions of you, flawed, scared, learning as they go. Some grew wiser through reflection, others just grew tired. Some evolved, others fossilized. And you can't afford to confuse one for the other. Because if you let the wrong kind of advice govern your life, you don't just inherit their fears, you replicate their regrets. That's how generational cycles form. The cautious raise the fearful raise the obedient, and obedience breeds stagnation. The only way to break it is through awareness, to see clearly where advice ends and truth begins. So next time an elder says, "I've lived long enough to know," ask gently, "Have you learned long enough to know?" That question alone separates information from insight, because living long isn't the same as living deeply, and that's the real revelation. Wisdom isn't in the wrinkles, it's in the willingness to question your own story. Once you understand that, advice stops being a command. It becomes data, something you can analyze, test, and apply if it fits. The power shifts back to you. You stop being a listener and start being a learner. And that's the moment you begin to grow wiser, not older. Revelation is never comfortable. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or light beams. It arrives as silence, the kind that follows after you realize half of what you believed was borrowed. Once you see that not every elder's advice is truth, something inside you breaks. But it's a necessary break, like a bone resetting into alignment. You start hearing things differently. The same advice that used to sound wise now feels heavy, conditional, outdated. And that's when you begin the hardest part of growth: learning to filter. Filtering advice isn't about rebellion. It's about discernment. It's the art of listening without absorbing everything. You start noticing patterns. Some people advise from love, others from fear. Some share stories to empower you, others to warn you not to outgrow them. Both speak loudly, but only one helps you grow. Here's what you learn quickly. Everyone speaks from their level of consciousness. A fearful person gives fearful advice. A curious person gives curious advice. A bitter person gives bitter advice. And a wise person doesn't give advice at all. They offer perspective and leave space for you to decide. That's the first marker of real wisdom: humility. When you start filtering, guilt shows up first. Because for the first time, you're not nodding politely to every opinion thrown at you. You start saying, that might not apply to me. You start holding your ground when someone insists they know better. It feels wrong at first. You've spent your whole life equating obedience with respect. So disagreement feels like betrayal. But what this really is birth. You're giving birth to your own authority. and birth is always messy. I remember when I stopped taking career advice from my uncle, a man I admired deeply. He had worked the same job for 30 years, saved meticulously, lived predictably. He meant well when he said, "Don't take risks, be practical. Stability first." For a while, I obeyed. I stayed safe, followed the predictable path, and hated every minute of it. Then one day, I realized something simple yet profound. His definition of safe was built from his fear of failure, not from my potential. The moment I saw that, something clicked. Advice is never universal. It's personal, dressed up as universal. That was my turning point. Not because I stopped listening, but because I started testing. When you test advice, you move from belief to understanding. You don't accept things blindly, you experiment. You watch what works, what fails, what aligns with your values. You become your own lab, and life becomes data. Here's the key skill in this transformation: observe the source before you absorb the message. When someone gives advice, ask yourself, does this person's life reflect the peace or success they speak about? Are they sharing insight or projecting fear? Are they open to being wrong? Do they speak from curiosity or certainty? Because certainty is seductive, but it's often a mask for insecurity. The wisest people I've met always use phrases like, "I could be wrong, but this worked for me, see if it fits. Here's what I learned, your path might differ." That humility signals maturity. Arrogant advice sounds confident, but it kills growth. Humble advice feels soft, but it sparks reflection. So here's what you do. Listen to everyone, but trust only what resonates after reflection. This doesn't mean cutting elders off or acting superior. That's just the ego flipping sides from submission to defiance. True wisdom lives between the two: respect without dependence. You can honor someone's experience while still making your own choices. You can say thank you and still think no. You can love deeply and still disagree completely. That balance, that quiet confidence, is what separates thinkers from followers. The next phase of transformation is internal, rebuilding your compass. When you've spent years depending on others to tell you what's right, your instincts go dull. You stop trusting your own signals, that subtle tug in your chest, that intuition that says, "This isn't it." Rebuilding that trust takes time. Start small. Say no to advice that feels off, even in minor things. Choose your own clothes when someone says what suits you. Take a different route to work just because you feel like it. Speak your perspective when someone interrupts you mid-sentence. These micro moments teach your subconscious one thing: my voice matters. And when you stack enough of those, your confidence grows quietly but powerfully. Something else happens too: you begin to see your elders differently, not as authorities, but as humans, complex, flawed, still learning. That shift removes resentment. You stop blaming them for bad advice because you realize they were doing their best with what they knew. And that understanding frees you, because as long as you're angry at them, you're still tied to their approval. Detachment isn't coldness, it's clarity. It means you can love people fully without needing their validation to move forward. Let me say something uncomfortable but necessary. You can outgrow people you respect. You can surpass your mentors. You can learn lessons they never did. And that's not disrespect, that's evolution. Growth is not betrayal. It is proof that their lessons planted something real in you, something capable of going further than they could. That's how wisdom moves through generations, not through blind repetition, but through courageous refinement. Once you learn to filter advice, you realize something profound most people don't think. They repeat. They recycle words they once heard and now pass them on with conviction. Real thinking is rare. Real self-awareness even rarer. And when you start truly thinking, you separate yourself from the noise. You start walking your own path, quietly, confidently. You'll stumble, sure, but those stumbles will be yours. And that's what makes them valuable. Because mistakes made from obedience teach nothing. Mistakes made from autonomy teach everything. Filtering advice is a lifelong discipline. It requires balance, respect without submission, openness without gullibility, skepticism without arrogance. But once you master it, you gain something priceless. You stop living on borrowed truths, And that's when real wisdom begins, not from someone else's story, but from your own unfolding experience. You'll know you've transformed when you can sit with an elder, listen deeply, thank them sincerely, and still walk away following your own compass without guilt. That's not rebellion. That's adulthood in its truest form. Awareness without application is just noise in a quieter tone. You can understand that not all advice is wise, but if you don't know how to deal with it in real life, you'll end up trapped again. So how do you actually live this truth? How do you honor elders, mentors, or family without letting their voices drown yours? Here's the thing: you don't need to reject them. You just need to reposition them. Stop putting every elder in the category of teacher. Put them in the category of storyteller. A teacher gives lessons that apply to you. A storyteller shares what applied to them. Your job is to listen with curiosity, not obedience. Extract the principle. Discard the projection. Let's break this down with something practical. The 3 filters of discernment. Filter 1. Source. Before you take advice, look at the person giving it. Don't judge them, observe them. Do they live what they preach? Does their life reflect the peace or success they promise? Do they speak from reflection or reaction? For example, if someone tells you how to manage your marriage but can't maintain one themselves, take their advice as data, not direction. If a relative warns you not to take risks but has never taken any, they're describing their limits, not yours. You can still respect them, but their life is the evidence, and evidence matters more than authority. In the end, advice is autobiographical. People don't tell you who you are, they reveal who they became. Filter 2. Context. Even good advice can be wrong if it's outdated. A lot of what elders say made perfect sense in their world. Their economy, culture, politics, and social structures shaped their thinking. But you're living in a different world, faster, connected, global, and driven by ideas, not hierarchy. For them, the safest path was stability. For you, the safest path might be adaptability. When your father tells you, stay in one company for life, remember he came from a time when loyalty was rewarded. When your mother says, don't talk back to authority, she came from a time when survival depended on silence. Context transforms meaning. Without it, you end up following rules written for a world that no longer exists. So before absorbing advice, ask, what world did this belief grow in? If it doesn't fit your current reality, it's wisdom for someone else, not you. Filter 3. Resonance. This one is the most personal. You've looked at the source, you've checked the context. Now it's time to look inward. How does this advice feel? Does it create peace or tension? Does it expand you or shrink you? If advice immediately triggers guilt, fear, or a sense of smallness, pause. That's not intuition. That's emotional manipulation dressed as guidance. True wisdom often feels calm, even when it's challenging. It doesn't scare you into obedience. It calls you into courage. Learn to trust that signal. It's your internal compass trying to speak again after years of being ignored. When something feels off, don't dismiss it. Explore it. That resistance isn't arrogance, it's the friction between borrowed beliefs and your authentic truth. Once you apply these filters consistently, your relationship with advice changes completely. You stop reacting emotionally. You start listening like a scientist, observing patterns, testing ideas, collecting results. You'll still make mistakes, but they'll be yours. And that's how real growth happens. Let's take this into 3 real-world scenarios. 1. Career advice. You'll hear older generations say, don't change jobs too often. It looks bad. But in today's economy, staying too long in one place can mean stagnation. Apply the filters. Source. Is the person giving this advice successful in your field or just repeating old norms? Context. Was their career built in a time when companies offered pensions and stability? Resonance. Does staying put feel like growth or fear? When you apply those questions, the truth becomes obvious. Their advice is rooted in loyalty to a system that no longer exists. You can thank them sincerely and still choose differently. 2. Relationship advice. Marriage is forever. Don't air your problems. Compromise no matter what. These sound noble, but they've destroyed more happiness than they've saved. Because endurance without understanding isn't strength, it's slow decay. Ask the filters again. Source: is this coming from someone who's actually happy in their marriage? Context: did they live in a time where divorce meant shame or survival risk? Resonance: does this advice help you grow or just keep the peace? Sometimes the bravest act of respect toward your elders' beliefs is to break the cycle they couldn't tee. 3. Identity and dreams. You can't make a living doing that. That's not practical. Be realistic. Translation: I never figured out how to make it work, so you probably won't either. But remember, every generation's impossible becomes the next generation's norm. Our ancestors thought flying was madness. Their grandchildren built planes. So when someone older tells you what's not possible, thank them for their concern, but don't inherit their ceiling. The world they feared is the one you were built to navigate. There's another layer to this application: how you respond. Because the goal isn't to prove them wrong. That's just ego wearing rebellion's jacket. The real goal is graceful independence. Here's a simple way to handle advice that doesn't resonate. Acknowledge: I see where you're coming from. Appreciate: that must have been true in your experience. Assert: let me think about it and see what fits. That's it. No fights, no disrespect, no guilt. Just clarity. You're honoring their experience while owning your freedom. That balance earns more respect than blind obedience ever could. The deeper you go into this, the more you realize that discernment is near to just a skill. It is a form of self-respect. Every time you think critically before following advice, you reaffirm a simple truth: my mind matters, my judgment counts, and that quiet self-trust compounds. It spills into how you make decisions, how you love, how you lead, and how you parent. Because one day, you'll be the elder, and your words will shape someone else's reality. What kind of advice will you give then? The recycled fear you once received, or the clarity you fought hard to earn? That question keeps you honest. The irony of wisdom is that the wiser you get, the less advice you give. You stop trying to impose and start trying to illuminate. You realize that everyone must walk their own labyrinth. Your job is only to hand them a candle, not a map. And maybe that's the real legacy of learning to filter advice. You stop being a follower and you stop being a preacher. You become a mirror reflecting clarity, not control. So yes, listen to the elders. Listen to everyone, in fact. But filter fiercely. Because in the end, wisdom isn't about knowing who to follow. It's about knowing when to stop following at all. By now, you see it clearly. Age doesn't guarantee wisdom. It only guarantees time. And time, left unexamined, just repeats itself. That's why you meet 70-year-olds who are still ruled by ego, still chasing validation, still angry at the world, and 20-year-olds who see through illusions like they've lived 100 lifetimes. The difference isn't the number of birthdays. It's awareness. It's the courage to question your own beliefs, not defend them. That's the real measure of growth. You were raised to think that questioning elders is disrespect. But blind obedience isn't respect, it's submission. And submission is how wisdom dies across generations. Because when one generation stops thinking, the next inherits not their knowledge, but their blindness. That's how cycles of fear, guilt, and limitation get passed down quietly, under the disguise of tradition. So here's your call to action. Be the generation that breaks that cycle. Listen always, but never kneel to noise, even if it speaks with age. You owe your elders gratitude, not surrender. Respect, not obedience. And love, but love doesn't mean silence. Sometimes love means saying, I understand that's what worked for you, but I need to find what works for me. That's not rebellion, that's responsibility. Because when you stop thinking for yourself, you don't just betray your potential, you betray the future that depends on your clarity. Here's what's often missed in all this. Wisdom isn't something you receive, it's something you refine. Every elder passes you raw material stories, fears, lessons, half-truths. Your job isn't to worship them. Your job is to process them, to melt them down in the fire of your own experience and extract what's pure. That's how civilizations evolve, through the courageous refinement of what came before. If every generation simply obeyed the previous one, we'd still be living in caves, calling thunder a god's anger. Progress was born from doubt. Wisdom grows through friction. And that friction, the courage to think differently, is your inheritance. Let's make this personal. Look at your own life for a second. How many of your current choices are truly yours? The career path, the partner you chose, the beliefs you defend, how many were shaped by what others told you makes sense? It's not your fault. You were raised in a system that rewarded compliance. But now you know better. And once you know better, you can't pretend ignorance is innocence. So pause today not to reject your past, but to reclaim your agency. Ask, is this belief mine, or was it handed to me? If it's not yours, start rewriting it, because you can't live a wise life built on someone else's fear. Here's the paradox most people never understand. When you start thinking independently, you actually respect your elders more, not less. Because for the first time, you see them as humans, not symbols. You understand their pain, their limitations, their context, and from that understanding comes compassion, not rebellion. You stop idealizing them and you start empathizing with them. You realize that many of them did the best they could with the tools they had. And that's why your role isn't to imitate them, it as to evolve them, to continue what they couldn't finish, to push the wisdom they started one step further. That's how you honor them, by transforming their lessons into something truer. You were not born to repeat. You were born to refine. And refinement requires discernment, the quiet courage to filter everything you hear, including this. So yes, listen to the elders, but also listen to the silence inside you. Because that silence, that gut feeling, that intuitive nudge, that's your inner elder. The one who doesn't age, doesn't bias, doesn't project. It's the voice of your own unfolding wisdom. If you follow that, you'll rarely go wrong. So here's the real challenge I leave you with. The next time someone older gives you advice, don't rush to agree or disagree. Just pause. Take a breath. Ask yourself quietly, is this advice rooted in fear or in clarity? Is it guiding me forward or keeping me safe? Is it true for me right now? Then decide, not from guilt, not from rebellion, but from truth. That's the only way wisdom survives, when each generation has the courage to retest it. And if one day you find yourself in their position, older, seasoned, offering advice, remember this conversation. Remember how it felt to be told what to do without being understood. And instead of preaching, ask questions. Instead of commanding, listen. Because real wisdom doesn't dominate, it illuminates. And if you can do that, if you can honor the past without being imprisoned by it, then you will have done something most people never do. You'll have broken the lineage of blind obedience. You'll have turned tradition into evolution. You will have proven that growing older and growing wiser are two entirely different things, and that one of them is your choice. So respect your elders, but follow the truth, because even fools grow older, but only the brave, the curious, and the conscious grow wise. You were told to listen to your elders. You did. You followed, trusted, obeyed, and somewhere along the way you stopped hearing your own voice. But here's the truth you were never told. Wisdom isn't inherited, it's earned. Age adds years, not awareness. Experience gives stories, yet not always insight. Some people live 70 years, others just live the same year 70 times. So from today, listen, but don't kneel. Respect, but don't surrender. Love them, but don't let their fears become your map. Because one day, you'll be the elder, and the world will listen to your words. What will you pass down, your fears or your freedom? Remember this. Growing old is automatic. Growing wise is a choice. And if this video woke something up in you, don't let it fade. Rewatch it. Reflect on it. And when you're ready, share it with someone who still believes every elder is right. Because truth spreads quietly, one awakened mind at a time.